1877. Jim Crow laws controlled the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportation. 1896. Plessy v. Ferguson was a constitutional law case of the U.S. Supreme Court. It controlled state racial segregation laws for public facilities under the doctrine of separate but equal. 1909. The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is a civil rights organization founded in 1909 to fight prejudice, lynching, and Jim Crow laws. 1930. The Nation of Islam is an organization composed mainly of African Americans, expressing the teachings of Islam and originally favoring the separation of black and white racial groups in the United States. 1942. CORE works with other civil rights groups and launched a series of initiatives including the Freedom Rides, desegregation of public facilities, the Freedom Summer Voter Registration Project, and the historic 1963 March on Washington. 1954. Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka was a United States Supreme Court case that fought against segregation in public schooling and showed how it is unconstitutional. Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer who was best known for his high success rate in arguing before the Supreme Court and for the victory in Brown v. Board of Education. De facto was a racial discrimination and segregation in the United States, and de jure was simply discrimination that was not segregation by law. 1955. Brown v. Board of Education II was a landmark United States Supreme Court case in which the court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. Rosa Parks was an activist in the civil rights movement. She was the main cause in the Montgomery bus boycott by getting herself arrested by not giving her seat up to a white man. The Montgomery bus boycott was a political and social protest campaign against the policy of racial segregation on the public transit system of Montgomery, Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr., an American civil rights activist and Baptist minister who first rose to prominence as the leader of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, challenging segregation of public transportation. 1957. The SCLC was an African American civil rights organization which was closely associated with its first president, Martin Luther King Jr. It had a large role in the American civil rights movement. The Little Rock Nine was a group of 9 African American students enrolled in Little Rock Central High School. Their enrollment was followed by the Little Rock Crisis, in which the students were initially prevented from entering the racially segregated school by Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas. 1960. The SNCC was a U.S. civil rights organization formed by students and active especially throughout the 1960s, whose aim was to achieve political and economic equality for blacks through local and regional action groups. Sit-ins are an organized passive protest, especially against racial segregation, in which the demonstrators occupied seats prohibited to them, as in restaurants and other public places. 1961. CORE came to work in the civil rights movements and launched a series of initiatives including the Freedom Rides, desegregation of public facilities, the Freedom Summer Voter Registration Project, and the historic 1963 March on Washington. The Freedom Riders were a group of 13 African American and white civil rights activists that launched the Freedom Rides, which were a series of bus trips through the American South to protest segregation in interstate bus terminals. 1963. March on Washington contained more than 200,000 Americans that gathered in Washington, D.C. for a political rally known as March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The Birmingham campaign was a movement organized in early 1963 by the SCLC to bring attention to the integration of African Americans from Birmingham, Alabama. The letter from Birmingham jail is a letter that Martin Luther King Jr. addressed to his fellow clergymen while he was in jail in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 after a nonviolent protest against racial segregation. 1964. Freedom Summer was a 1964 voter registration project in Mississippi, part of a larger effort by civil rights groups such as CORE and the SNCC to expand black voting in the South. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 were landmark civil rights and U.S. labor laws in the United States that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. 1965. The Selma campaign was the campaign where Martin Luther King Jr.'s SCLC made Selma, Alabama, the focus of its efforts to register black voters in the South. Malcolm X was an African American political leader of the 20th century. As a prominent black Muslim, Malcolm X explained the group's viewpoint in a book written by Alex Haley, The Autobiography of Malcolm X. He was assassinated in 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on August 6, 1965, aimed at overcoming legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote under the 15th Amendment. 1966. Stokely Carmicheal made the SNCC's national chairman. When he was elected national chairman of the SNCC in May 1966, Carmicheal had largely lost faith in the theory of nonviolent resistance and created a new chant, Black Power, which Martin Luther King was disappointed by. The Black Power and Black Panthers party's original purpose was to patrol African American neighborhoods to protect residents from active police brutality. The Panthers eventually developed into a Marxist revolutionary group that called for the arming of all African Americans. 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot at Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4, 1968. King was rushed to the St. Joseph's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. that evening. Even though Dr. King didn't get to see it, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed into law on April 1968, popularly known as the Fair Housing Act. It prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex.